today I'm continuing the conversation on Joseph Smith's polygamy. Welcome to Candlewick Library. I'm Cheryl, and welcome back to part 2 of the chapters that deal with Joseph Smith's polygamy. First, I'm briefly going to touch on chapter 23, Into Hiding. You will probably remember from a previous video that there was the Governor Boggs in Missouri that had given an order of extermination for Mormons after he'd received some bad information. In May 1842, word came to Nauvoo that Boggs had been shot by an unknown assailant, and it went through the city as if a great prophecy had been fulfilled. Boggs had been shot 3 times in the head, but he ended up not dying, miraculously. She writes, Boggs promptly swore to an affidavit charging Joseph with being an accessory before the fact of the intended murder, and persuaded Governor Reynolds to ask for his extradition on the ground that he was a fugitive from justice. When the sheriffs arrived in Nauvoo on August 8, 1842, armed with the writ and a warrant from Governor Carlin, both Joseph and Porter Rockwell submitted to arrest, but were released under a writ of habeas corpus issued by the Nauvoo Municipal Court. So Joseph had tons of witnesses that he was in Nauvoo on the day of the shooting. Rockwell, though, had, by all accounts, been in Missouri, and it is believed by most people that Porter Rockwell, who was a bodyguard of Joseph Smith, was the one that shot Governor Boggs. There is a lot of evidence, and he later on would become one of Brigham Young's bodyguards, and he's very known for the murders that he has committed in his time. It is not out of the question. Porter Rockwell left immediately for Philadelphia, and Joseph went into hiding. For 4 months, Joseph just lived in fear of being caught and taken to Missouri, where he was sure he would die. And he went from place to place, from hiding spot to hiding spot. His friends in Nauvoo put out rumors of him going to Wisconsin or him going to Washington. And there were even some rumors that he went to Europe. But the sheriffs continued to come to his home and to Nauvoo because they didn't believe the rumors, as they shouldn't have. During this time, Emma has another baby that also dies. So they have now had 8 children, but only 3 have lived. I don't know how much of it was Joseph's own decision and how much of it was other people talking him into it, but he decided to give himself up rather than to continue in hiding because he was pretty sure that he could get out of this. And so he went to a neighbor that had just had a baby and convinced them to let Emma nurse the baby to help her through the depression after this last baby had died, and also with him leaving to go give himself up. There was a lot of legal stuff going on at this time, but he did eventually get cleared of this, and so he was able to go back to normal. Porter Rockwell was not cleared, but she does describe him coming back at the end of this chapter. When he returned to Nauvoo in December 1843, Rockwell was a frightening apparition. His hair hung down to his shoulders, black and stringy like a witch's. His clothes were filthy and tattered. His shoes were in shreds. It was night when he rode across the river, and he went directly to Joseph's sumptuous new home, the Mansion House, where a dancing party was in progress. With a keen relish for practical jokes, Rockwell pushed his way past the guard with an oath and made for the prophet, muttering imprecations and pretending to be drunk. Taking him for a Missourian, Joseph began to scuffle with him and was ready to pitch him headlong out into the night when he got a good look at the man's face. "It's Porter!" he shouted and began thumping him on the back with joy. The women stopped screaming, the guards put away their bowie knives, and Rockwell became the lion of the evening. Laughing at his long hair, Joseph promised him that if he kept it long like Samson and lived faithful to the church, his enemies should have no power over him. Accepting this promise as the Lord's word, Porter heeded it into the end of his life. Joseph had not been long in the mansion house before he transformed it into a hotel, where he was weary of entertaining at his own expense a never-ending stream of curiosity seekers. His own family occupied spacious upstairs quarters, and the huge living room below was turned into a lobby and dining hall. Some weeks after Rockwell's return, Emma went to St. Louis to purchase furnishings. That's going to come into our story today in the next chapter. She returned to find in one corner of the lobby a well-equipped bar. Rockwell, his hair neatly braided and tied with a ribbon, polishing glasses and dispensing whiskey. "Joseph, what is the meaning of that bar in this house?" she cried with a passion that startled her oldest son, who had never heard his parents quarrel. Joseph was ready with arguments. Porter was penniless. He deserved much consideration for his 9 months in Missouri jail. His acquittal was of immeasurable aid. He said, "How does it look for the spiritual head of a religious body to be keeping a hotel which has a room fitted out as a liquor-selling establishment?" He reminded her that all taverns had bars, and while it was true that no grog shops were being permitted in Nauvoo at this time, there must be some place where distinguished travelers could be permitted the refreshment to which they were accustomed. The Nauvoo City Council had passed an ordinance giving him the sole right to dispense liquor in the hotel, and who better could be trusted with such a monopoly? And so she basically told him that she would not live there with the bar there. And so he was at liberty to make his own choice, but either the bar went out of the house or she would. And so he said, very well, I will have it removed at once. And he did. Now I'm going to move on to chapter 24, the wives of the prophet. There's going to be a lot of them that I'm going to talk about today. First, I'll read in here. Probably no one will ever know exactly how many women Joseph Smith married. Brigham Young said quite frankly to William Hepsworth Dixon in 1866, I myself sealed dozens of women to Joseph. One Mormon historian drew up a list of 27 wives, but it is clear from all the available published and manuscript records that the number may have reached or even exceeded 50. In January 1846, 18 months after his death, 30 women were sealed to the prophet for eternity in the Nauvoo temple and to various other men for time. Since it's clear from other records that more than 2/3 of these women had already been married to Joseph during his lifetime, that this was simply a new solemnization of an earlier ceremony. So that is what I talked about in an earlier video, that they were already married and apparently sealed to him for eternity, but once the temple opened, then they wanted to reestablish that eternity sealing. In later years in Utah, scores of women were sealed to the prophet posthumously, but since it is impossible to determine how many of these women had been married to him during his lifetime, they're not included here, and I'm also not going to include them in my video. If I don't have multiple sources that have stated these women were his wives while he was alive, I'm not going to include them. The ones that I'm reading and the list that I'm going to show you from this book are incomplete. And in fact, there's one wife that is not in this book that I found out from other sources. This is as good as we can get it at this point. So I'm going to show the first 23 women of this list right now. It shows their names, the age and of when they were married, and the date of the marriage. So you can see it starts there with Emma Hell in January of 1827, and then it has Fanny Alger, and it goes down through a lot of the women that we talked about in the last video, and ends on this picture at number 23 with Emily Partridge, which we will be talking about today. This is part 2, starting at number 24 with Eliza Partridge and going down to number 49, Sophia Woodman. The first 36 wives she listed in approximate chronological order of their marriage to Joseph Smith, and the remainder, where we don't know for sure the exact date of the marriage, they're listed alphabetically. The prophet married 5 pairs of sisters, and Patty and Sylvia Sessions were mother and daughter. I think it's important here to note that if you go to Leviticus in the Bible in chapters 18 and 20, it says that you should not marry mothers and daughters, and you should not marry sisters, so that there will not be competition between them. Not only was he already doing something wrong by doing polygamy and by marrying other men's wives, but he also was violating something in the Bible about marrying sisters and marrying a mother and daughter. First, I'm going to go down through a list of the women we haven't talked about yet in the order that they were on that list I just showed you. And then I'm going to go deeper into a few stories that are very important. So I'm going to be starting with Delsina Johnson Sherman. Delsina was born in 1806 in Vermont. She was raised in a very large family with a really religious mother and an alcoholic father. At 22 years old, she married Lyman Sherman. He was 24 years old. In 1831, they were visited by Mormon missionaries. They were soon baptized and moved to Kirtland. Lyman assisted with the laying of the cornerstone of the Kirtland Temple, and he was also in that Zion's camp that went to Missouri. After he returned to Kirtland, he became one of the 70, which is in the organization of the hierarchy of the church. He later became one of the first presidents of the 70. He was sent on a mission, and while on his mission, he took a cold and came home, and he died in Far West in 1839, leaving her a widow with 6 children. After that, she went to Nauvoo. About this time, her brother was sent to Canada on a mission, and he wrote this. The marriage of my eldest sister to the prophet Joseph Smith was before my return to Nauvoo. I asked no questions. She lived with another one of Joseph Smith's wives, Louisa Beeman, who we've already talked about, and less than a year later, Delsina and Louisa and her brother would be influential in introducing their younger sister, Almira, to plural marriage, and she would also become one of Joseph Smith's wives. After Joseph Smith's death, she married a man named Almon Babbitt, who would also marry Maria Lawrence, who was another one of Joseph Smith's wives. When all the saints left for Utah, Delsina and Almon stayed behind. But a few years later, he decided to go without her. In 1850, she and her mother and her children left for Utah on their own. They had a little bit of a delay in Council Bluffs and some health issues, but eventually showed up in Utah in late 1854. But she had really bad rheumatoid arthritis, and she ended up dying in October of that same year. Next is Martha McBride Knight. She was born in 1805 in New York. When she was 21, she married Vincent Knight. He was successfully selling farm produce. 8 years later, they met Joseph Smith and were converted. In 1835, they moved to Kirtland. They lived in a really nice house near the temple, and I'm going to show a picture of that. This is a picture of that house when they would have lived in it, and another picture of what it looked like in 2003. They would eventually end up in Nauvoo with all the other saints after a lot of persecution, and this is the house that they lived in Nauvoo. So they seem to have been members that had quite a bit of money. In Nauvoo, she was another one of the founding members of the Relief Society, and he was appointed bishop of one of the 3 Nauvoo wards, which is the congregation. Joseph Smith soon taught him about polygamy, and he ended up taking on a second wife. His new wife had been married before, and her husband had been killed in the Hans Mill massacre that I talked about a couple of videos ago. Martha didn't seem to be fazed by him taking another wife. When he came to her and was really worried about telling her, she said, "Is that all?" In about mid-1842, it seems like he may have had dysentery and he died. And less than a month later, she married Joseph Smith. Heber C. Kimball performed the ceremony. Soon after, her 5-year-old daughter died from the measles. Her oldest daughter was 17 and was being approached by a lot of men. One of those men was a man named Sylvester who was opposed to polygamy. Martha and Joseph Smith wanted this daughter to become one of the plural wives of Joseph's brother Hiram Smith, but thankfully she said no, and she married Sylvester and left Nauvoo and the church. But her other daughter would go into polygamy. After Joseph Smith died, Martha always kept a locket of his hair. She went on to marry Heber C. Kimball, and she lived with 3 of his other wives. But eventually she ended up on the Belknap farm, which there are 5,000 birds flying outside of my window right now. That was like a scene out of a movie. Anyway, she ended up living with her daughter-in-law on their farm with the Belknap family. Gilbert Belknap was called to settle the Ogden area. Their first home was a dugout in the ground, and so they were in great poverty. On the journey to Ogden, Martha was thrown under the wagon wheels, and as they brought her body broken to this dugout, she was heard to say, "I have no home on earth." She did recover from that. She became well known for her gift of sewing. She died in 1901 in Hooper, Utah at the age of 96 years old. The reason I wanted to show her houses at the beginning was to show how she had started, the kind of homes that she lived in at the beginning of her life. To think about the fact that she went from that to living in a dugout to then, living in poverty in homes, but in poverty for the rest of her life. The next woman is Ruth Vose Sayers. Ruth was born in 1808 in Massachusetts. In 1835, she was baptized, and she grew up assisting her aunt, Polly, who was the only other member of her family that became a member of the church. She assisted her in her very successful upholstery business. In 1836, Lyman E. Johnson and John F. Boynton, who were 2 apostles, borrowed considerable money, that's a quote, considerable money from her Aunt Polly and other saints in the area, and those loans were never repaid. Ruth went to live at this point in St. Louis. She married Edward Sayers, who was a very well-known horticulturist and florist from England. He had published the books, The American Flower Garden Companion, adapted for the Northern States, and Treatise on the Culture of the Dahlia and Cactus, which was the first American book ever published on a specific flower. The poet Edgar Allan Poe raved about both of these books. He was not converted to Mormonism, but they got married and they ended up in Nauvoo sometime in 1841. They moved to a farm just north of the city. She joined the Relief Society, and when Joseph Smith was in hiding, he hid in their home multiple times. In February of 1843, Ruth married Joseph Smith in a secret ceremony, but she continued to live with Edward. We don't know if he knew. Ruth was visiting her Aunt Polly in Boston when Joseph Smith was killed. Heber C. Kimball, Wilford Woodruff, and Brigham Young were all in the area as well and came and visited the 2 women. So after Joseph Smith's death, by July, Ruth and Edward were in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and they left for Utah on July 10th, 1849, in Silas Richards Pioneer Company, which arrived in Salt Lake on October 25th through 29th, and they first lived on the corner, afterwards known as the American Hotel corner. He continued with his gardening and seed business and died in 1861. Ruth became ill and died in June 1844. Desdemona Wadsworth Fulmer. She was born in 1809 in Pennsylvania. She said, "When I was 13 years old, I prayed much in secret, alone to the Lord. From that time, I became very serious of mind." She heard the LDS missionaries preaching and went to Kirtland, then moved to Missouri and lived on her brother's farm. And she was living at Hans Mill at the time of the massacre, and she and other family members had to hide in the woods to escape the mob. They obtained land 4 miles east of Nauvoo. They owned 1/4 section of the land known as the Fulmer Tract. They were closely associated with Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith. And by this time, Desdemona was 30 years old, and it said that she was living in Joseph Smith's home by this point. Sometime before the spring of 1843, and for unknown reasons, she moved out of the Smith's home and asked to board with William Clayton, who was Joseph Smith's scribe. Brigham Young performed the wedding ceremony in July 1843, sealing her to Joseph Smith. But William Clayton recorded in his journal, January 29, 1844, that he asked her to leave his house. He wrote, "She has treated my family unfeelingly and unkindly in various ways, and I requested her to look for another home." She said she wouldn't until she discussed it with Joseph Smith, but he wouldn't give her an audience. So Brigham Young, Heber Kimball, and William Clayton only would talk to her. And then during this time, she also had a dream that she wrote about. She said, "In the rise of polygamy, I was warned in a dream that Emma was going to poison me. I told my dream to brother Joseph, and he told me that it was true and she would do it if she could." After Joseph's death, when she did the resealing in the temple, Ezra T. Benson stood in as proxy, and she was sealed to him for time and became Ezra's third wife. This was a very unhappy marriage, and he ended up leaving for the West without her, and he married 2 more women along the way. So she arrived in Salt Lake City in October 1848 in Willard Richards' company. By 1850, we do know that she was living in the household of Ezra T. Benson in Salt Lake City. But by September of 1852, they had formally divorced. At this point, she began living with the Ira James family, and shortly after that, she married a man named Harrison Parker McLean, and Ezra stood in as a witness. These stories are so weird to me, how these people it almost seems like that they're making marriage the most important and solemn and sacred thing, but then they also treat it so flippantly at the same time. She had 1 child, but that child died the same year, and then she had no more children after that. Her husband was an elder in the church, but he began to turn away from the church, and he ended up joining a Morrisite, which was like a splinter group, and he ended up leaving with a woman from that group. So after that, she lived with her brother, David Fulmer, and his family, trading a cow and a calf to pay for her to be able to have a room at their house. And then she died February 1886 at 77 years old. And there was one quote of her that said that she was a quiet, unassuming, faithful woman. Now I'm going to talk about Elmira Johnson. A minute ago, I talked about her sister. So she was born in Vermont in 1812. We just talked about her sister, Delsina, who was also a plural wife of Joseph Smith, and that they were a part of a large family with a very religious mother and an alcoholic father. As I talked about, they gathered in Kirtland first, then Missouri, and then Macedonia, which was just approximately 20 miles east of Nauvoo. So her brother Benjamin that I talked about was an agent for the church for buying property. And on April 1st, 1843, Joseph Smith visited Macedonia and stayed at the Johnson home. Her older sister had already married Joseph 10 months before and was living with Louisa Beeman, like I said when I talked about her. So her other sister was already married to Joseph Smith, but they didn't know about it yet. So Joseph Smith shows up at their house, and he takes the brother for a walk, and they sit down on a log. And this is what her brother said. "He had come to ask me for my sister, Almina. His words astonished me and almost took my breath. I sat for a time amazed. I could not comprehend anything. I said, 'Brother Joseph, this is something I did not expect, whether it is right. I do not. I want to do just as you tell me, but how can I teach my sister what I myself do not understand?' Joseph promised he would preach a sermon later that evening, and saying that it would relate to this doctrine and that Benjamin would be the only one that would understand why. And that evening, he spoke of the parable of the talents. And I brought that up earlier of how many times the parable of the talents is used synonymously with women and wives. So Benjamin understood that. He understood that he was using that to talk about wives. And he said, 'To me there was a horror in the idea of speaking to my sister upon such a subject, the thought of which made me sick. I stood before her trembling, my knees shaking.' He found the words and spoke to her, but said her heart was not yet won." So Joseph Smith then asked him to bring his sister to Nauvoo, to their other sister's house. And there they met Joseph Smith, Hiram, and William Clayton. Hiram pulled Benjamin aside and told him that Joseph was indeed acting in God's name. And then he said to Elmira, "I know that Joseph was commanded to take more wives, and he waited until an angel with drawn sword stood before him and declared that if he longer delayed fulfilling that command, he would slay him. The Lord has revealed the principle of plural marriage to me, and I know that it is true. I will have you for a sister, and you will be blessed." Hiram came to me and said I need not be afraid. I had been fearing and doubting about the principle, and so had he, but he now knew it was true. After this time, I lived with the prophet Joseph as his wife. So Benjamin said that she stood by the prophet Joseph Smith and was sealed to him as a wife. by Brother Clayton, and he wrote this: "After which the prophet asked me to take my sister to occupy room number 10 in his mansion home during her stay in the city." And if you remember a minute ago, I said how Emma and Joseph lived in the mansion home, which was turned into a hotel. So it sounds like he's getting different wives for different rooms. They stayed for 3 weeks and then went back to Macedonia. 3 weeks later, Joseph visited them again there, and her brother made a lot of statements about how, yes, they were occupying the same room and bed. Joseph Smith remained 2 days lodging at my house with my sister as man and wife, and to my certain knowledge, he occupied the same bed with her. This visit was on the 16th and 17th of May, 1843, returning to Nauvoo on the 18th. After his death, she married Reuben Barton, who was widowed with 3 children. They had 5 daughters. Unfortunately, as you're seeing is more common, the first daughter, Mary Ellen, died only 2 years later. And then her 4th child also died before even being 1 year old. Their 3rd daughter was mentally impaired. And it doesn't specify how, but just that she was mentally impaired. This is a quote: "Almira wondered if it was punishment because she had remarried after Joseph Smith died." In 1860, Reuben became disillusioned with the LDS Church, which caused contention in their marriage, and then they separated. So she traveled alone with 3 daughters, and in 1861 settled in Parowan. All of her daughters would end up dying before her, and as much as we know, she spent the remainder of her life taking care of her daughter that lived the longest, which was the one that was mentally impaired, until they both died in the mid-1890s. And she had a stroke and died when she was 83 years old. Now I'm going to talk about the Lawrence sisters, Maria and Sarah. We don't have a ton of information on either of them, but what we do have mostly comes from William Law. Fair Latter-day Saints says that we can't trust what he said because he was untrustworthy, but I actually find, and I'll get into this later, but I find William Law to actually be an extremely trustworthy source because I think he was one of the only men in Nauvoo that had integrity. That is my personal opinion from what I've seen of him. And so I do put more weight on things he said. I actually think that William Law is more trustworthy than Joseph Smith. You can have that in your mind of that there are some people that say that not all of it might be accurate, but I do believe that it probably is. Joseph Smith was accused of taking them into his confidence at a young age and then taking over and mismanaging their estate. And this is why people don't like the information. So Maria was born in December 18th, 1823, and Sarah was born May 13, 1826, 3 years later. They were born in Ontario, Canada. They were 13 and 11 when they met Joseph Smith when he visited Canada in 1837. Their family converted and soon moved to Illinois in 1840. Their father died very soon after their arrival, and at this point they were 14 and 17. He left them with a very considerable estate when he died. This is a quote: "Under his will, the wife of the deceased received 1/3 of the inheritance, and the rest would be spent among the heirs, but a legal guardian was required for the family." Joseph Smith was appointed as the legal guardian to the minor heirs and as the trustee for the estate. Their mom, Margaret, remarried Josiah Butterfield, and so they tried to get the estate rights back from Joseph, but they were unsuccessful. Josiah Butterfield came to my house and insulted me so outrageously that I kicked him out of the house, across the yard, and into the street. That's from Joseph Smith's History of the Church. In 1842, Sarah and Maria were 16 and 18, and they began living at the Smiths' home, probably as hired help, like most of the women that lived there. In spring of 1843, Joseph married both of them, and apparently Emma Smith knew about them and gave permission. A friend remembered this: "Maria suffered her doubts, her fears, her uncertainties as to whether she was acting right or wrong, for she had a conscience and wanted to be right. She said if there was any truth in Mormonism, she would be saved, for my yoke has not been easy, nor my burden light." So William Law, who once was a trusted friend of Joseph Smith and a member of the first presidency of the church, he had a falling out with Joseph over polygamy. He disagreed with Joseph, and when he spoke up, he was removed as an apostle. It is said that William, quote, "with his arms around the neck of the prophet and tears streaming down his face, pleaded with him to withdraw the doctrine of plural marriage." So when he found out that the Lawrence sisters had become involved with Joseph Smith and that he had control of their estate, it was too much for him. There's also rumors at this time that Joseph Smith had approached William Law's wife to try to make her one of his plural wives, and that her refusal and William Law's anger over it led to his excommunication. William Law then filed a lawsuit against Joseph Smith for, quote, "living in an open state of adultery with Maria Lawrence." Joseph Smith responded in one of his Sunday sermons. He said, Another indictment has been got up against me. What a thing it is for a man to be accused of committing adultery and having 7 wives when I can only find one. Of course, at this time, he had many wives already. William Law went on to publish the expositor that I showed you earlier, which exposed Joseph Smith's polygamy. Within days, Joseph had ordered the burning of this newspaper office and the destruction of the Nauvoo expositor. That led, of course, to Joseph's death, and so these sisters become widows only a little over a year after their wedding. Their estate was tied up with Joseph's and Emma. They would try for years to get back this money that they were supposed to have inherited. Sarah was then sealed to Heber C. Kimball, and she continued west with the Saints. She later came back to Nauvoo again, but then she did end up in Utah in 1850. But she was very unhappy in her marriage to Heber C. Kimball, as most of the women married to him were. She divorced him in 1851 and took her 4 children. She sewed dresses to make a living, and in 1853, she married a divorced man who apparently had got a small fortune in gold in California. Unfortunately, she had a bad relationship with his daughter and was considered kind of an evil stepmother by her. But they moved to Napa in California. When they moved to California, they left Mormonism, and so a lot of the Mormons left behind said that she had become prideful and with the money and with this new husband, and that was why they left the church. She died of cancer in San Francisco in 1872 at only 46 years old. Maria was sealed to Brigham Young after Joseph's death, but then she did not leave for Utah. She stayed behind in Nauvoo. She then married a Colonel A.W. Babbitt and had 1 child, and she died in Nauvoo in 1847 at only 22 years old. According to reports of her, she was a very sad person. An interesting thing about these sisters is in the 1990s, there was a man named Mark Hoffman that was forging a bunch of documents that the church leaders then bought. I talked about that a few videos ago. And one of his documents, this is what it was about. It was about these sisters and their land. And so it showed that the church leaders at the time, they actually did believe that Joseph had taken their land from them. You know, we don't know all the details of it, but that is one of the controversies when it comes to these sisters. And of course, people say, oh, this is from William Law, and they call him a bitter apostate. And that also is a pattern that is now. I would be considered a bitter apostate just for speaking out against the LDS Church now. It doesn't matter if we're speaking truth. It doesn't matter if we have reasons to be angry at the LDS Church or to want to expose certain things in it. That's what people will say about us. And so I feel maybe I feel a kinship a little bit with William Law, because I see that he was against something that was wrong and he was trying to speak out for goodness. And yet he's remembered in the LDS Church as a bitter apostate. Next is Flora Ann Woodworth. She was 16 when she married Joseph Smith. She was born in 1826 in New York. Her father was an architect and stonemason named Lucian. We don't know much about their conversion to the church, but in 1843, he was serving as an architect and construction foreman for the Nauvoo house, which was a pet project of Joseph Smith. She was a friend and schoolmate of Helen Mar Kimball, who we'll talk about later. She's his youngest bride. In spring, Joseph's trusted secretary, William Clayton, testified that Joseph Smith married Lucian's 16-year-old daughter, Flora Ann. The story is told that a boy named Orange White, who was 19 years old, returned from a church mission in the spring of 1843. He was looking for a wife to marry before they were all gone, and he began to keep company with Flora. They were walking together one day near Joseph Smith's home when Joseph stopped in his carriage and asked them if they wanted a ride. At this point, Joseph Smith and Flora were already married, but Orange didn't know that. They ended up at the Woodworth's home, and they all went in, and this is what Orange said about that. After we got in the house, Sister Woodworth took me in another room and told me that Flora was one of Joseph's wives. He said that he knew that Joseph Smith had other wives besides Emma, but he just didn't know that Flora was one of them. And he gave her a mild lecture, he said, for not telling him, and he went to look for a companion elsewhere. Shortly after that, he was called on another mission. William Clayton talked about many visits to the Woodworth home to see Flora. And in fact, he wrote about her in the diary logbook more than any of Joseph Smith's other wives. One of the most famous stories about this relationship is when Emma became aware of this secret relationship. She was already upset from a letter that she had found from Eliza Snow. And she and Joseph went on a carriage ride, and she had him drop her off at the Woodworth house while he went to do some church business at the temple. She didn't know that Flora had already been his wife since the spring, but there ended up being a confrontation between them when she discovered that Flora had a gold watch that Joseph had given her. He had also given a gold watch to Eliza Snow, and so Emma knew immediately what that meant. Joseph Smith returned when Emma was demanding that gold watch be given back to her from Flora. William Clayton wrote on August 22nd, "On their return home, she abused him much, and also when he got home. He had to use harsh measures to put a stop to her abuse, but finally succeeded." There is speculation that Joseph Smith was also sealed to her mother, Phoebe, and Lucian and Phoebe also received their endowment into the Holy Order at around this time. When Joseph Smith was killed, then Flora became a widow at age 17. Later that year, she married Carlos Grove, who was a rich Mormon. They had 2 to 3 children. Her friend Helen wrote that Flora wasn't happy with this husband, and when she received her endowment later, she did it without him by her side. Her mother, Phoebe, was sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity, with her dad standing in as proxy and being married for time by Brigham Young. But we don't know for sure if that was a re-solemnization of an earlier ordinance or if that was just her doing it after he died. And her dad would go on to also have more polygamous wives. In 1846, Flora and Carlos went to Utah, but along the way they stopped at winter quarters like most people did. And while there, Carlos disappears from the census records. So we're not quite sure if he died or if he left or what happened. So she never made it to Utah and died in Iowa in 1850 in her mid-20s. Next is Rhoda Richards. She was born in 1784 in Massachusetts. She was one of 11 children. She was a cousin to Brigham Young, but is known more for being the sister of Willard Richards, who was an apostle. As one of the older children, she had a lot of responsibilities and household chores and helping to take care of the other children. Her niece, Lula Richards Green, said this about her. "When grown, she was a little below medium height, possessed a small trim figure and a face usually expressive of innocent fun and merriment. Her eyes were dark and brilliant. She was a girl and a woman of rare beauty." In her 20s, Rhoda fell in love with Ebenezer Damon, a widower with a daughter, and she was very fond of his daughter. Her niece also wrote this: "Ebenezer Damon was a man of sterling worth and integrity, whom Aunt Rhoda loved as such a woman loves but once in her lifetime." So while they were still engaged, he ended up getting sick, and she and her mother tried to nurse him back to health, but he ended up dying. She wrote, "Mr. Damon's remains have been deposited near the meeting house. Farewell to all joys. My comforts are fled. The friend of my choice is now numbered with the dead." She was devastated. She learned of the Mormons, and through her cousin Joseph Young, she became baptized. She believed that she had been miraculously healed many times, and so this helped her in her testimony. And in 1842, she moved to Nauvoo and met Joseph Smith. She had pledged her life and her love to her dead fiance, so at age 58, she was still single. But her brother was very close to Joseph Smith, and in the spring of 1843, she was living in Joseph Smith's store. We don't know much about why, but on June 12th, she married Joseph Smith, and her brother Willard performed the marriage, and she became his 28th wife. She wrote this: "In my young days, I buried my first and only love, and true to that affiance, I have passed companionless through life, but am sure of having my proper place and standing in the resurrection, having been sealed to the prophet Joseph, according to the celestial law, by his own request, under the inspiration of divine revelation." So she lived with her brother Levi and had little personal relationship with Joseph Smith. So obviously this is one of the women that he wouldn't have really had a full marriage with, and this was more of he's giving her the celestial benefits. Willard ended up being in prison with Joseph Smith when Joseph Smith died. Rhoda did marry her cousin Brigham Young in early 1845, becoming his 22nd wife, but that did not seem to be an intimate relationship either. They came to Utah, and she spent weeks living in a wagon until she moved in with her brother Willard near the Temple Block. She died from a cold at the age of 94. Again, this is not one of the saddest stories. It's sad for her, for things that happened to her, but her marriage to Joseph isn't one of the ones that just makes you upset or sad. Next is Hannah Els. She was born in 1813 in England. She immigrated to America and lived in Philadelphia. She lived with her brother, Josiah Els, and he was converted to Mormonism. By 1841, they had relocated to Nauvoo. Little is known about her except that she was tall, dignified, a good seamstress, and in Nauvoo, she opened a dressmaking business. She married Joseph Smith sometime before the summer of 1843, and she lived in the home of a man named John Benbow and with her brother at different times. Benbow wrote about her, "President Smith frequently visited his wife Hannah at my house. It was only a little over a year before he died. There are statements saying that she was sad when her brother was disfellowshipped and left for the RLDS. She died in Nauvoo in 1845 of unknown reasons, but she was always very well spoken of. Melissa Lott. She was born in 1824 in Pennsylvania. Little is known of her childhood except that her family moved around a lot, and they were converted to the Mormon Church around 1834. In 1836, they ended up in Kirtland. Her father invested in the Kirtland Safety Anti-Banking Society, and lost most of his savings. She was baptized at the age of 13. Their family soon moved near Han's mill, and her father was a Danite leader. So we talked about that. The Danites were the ones that were going out and burning the Missourians' property. In June 1842, they were living in Pike County and settled a few miles south of Carthage Road, and they worked on Joseph Smith's farm, where her father was managing the farm for Joseph Smith. That same year, Melissa was 18 years old, and she moved to live in Joseph Smith's home to probably help with the chores and children. Joseph Smith III said this about her. Melissa was a tall, fine-looking woman with dark complexion, dark hair and eyes. She was a good singer, quite celebrated in a local way. I have heard her sing at parties and receptions, in private homes, and on stage where theatrical performances were given. She left Joseph Smith's house and went back to her family farm, but within a month, Eliza Snow, Elvira Holmes, Elizabeth Durfee, and Elizabeth Whiting had come to visit her there and prepare her to hear about the principal. By September, she had agreed to marry Joseph. And so she did so on September 20th, 1843. Her parents were witnesses and Hiram Smith officiated. On the day of her marriage to Joseph, her parents, Cornelius and Pramila, were allowed to be sealed together for eternity, which at that point was an honor that wasn't given to everyone yet. She wrote this: I did not go to church with Joseph Smith, was never seen on the streets or in public places with him as his wife during his lifetime. But later on in the Temple Lot case, she did say that she was Joseph Smith's wife in very deed. Her father entered the Holy Order and became one of the Council of 50. She returned to the Smith home to live after this and to help Emma with the children. Joseph III, Frederick, and Alexander attended the same school as she did, and so she would escort them back and forth. And that's something also to think about, that his wife and his children went to school together. After Joseph Smith's death, she stayed on to help Emma for a time and had several suitors, but her father wouldn't allow it. On February 8, 1846, she was sealed to Joseph for eternity, with John Milton Bernheisel standing proxy, and then she was sealed to him for time. He was 47 years old and bishop in Nauvoo, and he already had 6 wives. And he was one of the adopted sons to Joseph Smith, or adopted as a son or brother or whatever it was that he was sealed to Joseph Smith. So little is known about their marriage, but it didn't last. The Lot family left and went to winter quarters, where she would then lose several family members. So she traveled west with the Heber C. Kimball Company. 3 years later, on May 13, 1849, she married 25-year-old Ira Joan Willis for time. He had been in the Mormon Battalion. They lived for a year in Salt Lake City in very primitive conditions, whatever that means, and then they went to Lehi and lived on a farm. The settlement became known as Lotville. They had 7 children, 4 sons and 3 daughters. He did end up taking on a second wife, and she was only 16 years old, but that ended quickly with no children. In 1863, he was crossing a creek in Lehi hauling wood and fell somehow, and he and their 9-year-old son both died. So she was left with 4 small children to care for. She died on July 13, 1898 at 74 years old. Fanny Young. Fanny Young was born in 1787 in Massachusetts. From that date, you can tell that she would have been one of the older wives. Her father, John, was a veteran of 3 Revolutionary War campaigns under George Washington. Fanny was one of the last, if not the last woman to marry Joseph Smith. She was Brigham Young's sister. She was 13 when he was born, and she was put in charge of all of her younger siblings. She ended up marrying a man named Robert Carr when she was 18 years old, but it was a very bad marriage. He was known for being unfaithful. They had 0 children, so she ended up leaving him and going back home. Her mom was sick, and she ended up being able to take care of her mom before her mom died. She took on the responsibility then of the younger children. Her younger brother Lorenzo said this: as she was the oldest of the girls of my father's family, then at home, from that time forward, she was a mother to me and the rest of the family. The Kimballs lived nearby, and she would occasionally help out at their home as well. Helen said this: she was a true saint and was beloved by all who had the pleasure of her acquaintance. She was described as a pretty woman with dark, waving hair and a sensitive, nervous organization. In 1832, she married Roswell Murray, who was 62 years old, and Heber C. Kimball's father-in-law. She was 45 years old. Around that time, her family was baptized, but her husband was reluctant to be baptized. This would be Helen Mar Kimball. Again, we'll talk about her in a little while, but it was her grandfather, and she said this: my grandfather Murray was not a member of any church. A more noble, kind-hearted man never lived. He was generous to a fault, and some were unprincipled enough to take advantage of it. He was never known to refuse a favor, and he would often rise from his bed when he was sick to go and do a job to accommodate a neighbor. He was a man of but a few words, and some called him an infidel. Fanny and Roswell moved to Kirtland and eventually Nauvoo. Soon after, he was visiting some of his children in New York and he died. She became a widow at the age of 52. Soon after, her father died as well. In fall of 1843, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and Fanny were discussing the belief of the necessity of plural marriage to get exaltation into the celestial kingdom. She was unimpressed and she said this, "Now don't talk to me. When I get into the celestial kingdom, if I ever get there, I shall request the privilege of being a ministering angel. That is the labor I wish to perform. I don't want any companion in that world, and if the Lord will make me a ministering angel, it is all I want." Joseph Smith then replied to her, "Sister, you talk very foolishly. You do not know what you will want." And then he told Brigham Young, "Here, Brother Brigham, you seal this lady to me." Brigham said that Fanny submitted to Joseph's impromptu proposal, and he sealed her to him. Joseph was killed less than a year later, and obviously this was most likely not an intimate marriage either. When all of Joseph Smith's wives were later sealed to him in the temple after it was built, she did not redo it, but she did get her own endowment. She spent 4 winters at Winter's Quarter and set out for Utah in the summer of 1850. She was very weak and ill. In the 1850 census, it shows her living in Salt Lake City at the age of 63. After completion of Brigham Young's Lion House, Fanny was offered a room there and lived in comfort, although she had a terrible nervous condition. She later told Heber Kimball that she did not want a history of her life published because she had lived a lonely life and she did not want a picture taken of her either. As she was living there, she began to complain about her health a lot. Brigham Young tried to comfort her, reminding her that there was help in the gospel. And the wives and other people living there, they got really tired and they complained about her complaining. But it turns out that she had cancer and she was suffering great pain. She died at 71 years old, having left the Lion House and was at the home of her niece, Olive Gray Frost. She was born in 1816 in Maine. She was the 8th of 11 children. She was known from a very early age to be the kind of child that would retire to the forest to a quiet spot to pray and to pour her soul in secret prayer to that being who rewards openly and frequently. She incurred ridicule thereby from those who were less sober-minded. She enjoyed sewing and she became so skilled she would help women with their sewing. She was baptized in 1839 and was not treated very well because of it. Her sister had already converted and moved to Kirtland, where she married Parley P. Pratt, who was also an apostle. They were leaving for England, and so they stopped in Maine to visit along the way, and they took Olive with them to England. So these 2 sisters were among the very first missionary women of the church. The cold, damp weather was not good for her health, and apparently sometimes if she was outside walking for too long, she would spit blood. Their home became a meeting place and a lodging place for missionaries, and Mary and Olive would help out with the church duties that he had. In 1842, they moved to Liverpool to supervise the immigration process. And so on October 29th, 1842, they left with 250 converts for Nauvoo. It was a really rough journey and took 10 weeks. Along the way, Olive got measles, but she had recovered by the time they got to Illinois. When they got there, they were greeted by Joseph Smith. Her sister was very pregnant at the time, and so one of his bodyguards picked her up and carried her, and they all went to the mansion house. It isn't known when Joseph Smith introduced her to the principle of plural marriage, but Parley took on a second wife, which was extremely difficult for Mary. And she would eventually leave Parley and divorce him and become sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity, with Parley standing in as proxy. Again, that's one of those weird situations. I'm divorcing you and I'm going to seal myself for eternity to this guy, and you're going to stand there and pretend to be him in the ceremony. It was around this time that Olive was married to Joseph Smith. We just don't know the exact date. And then she joined the Relief Society. Joseph died about a year later, and she became the 11th wife for life of Brigham Young. She died at 28 years old, probably from malaria. There was one quote by a Joseph E. Robinson, who was a member of the church. He said, "During the afternoon, I called on Aunt Lizzie. She knew Joseph Smith had more than 2 wives and said that he married Olive Frost and she had a child by him, but they have both died." There was some confusion about that statement because it makes it sound like she died in childbirth, but she didn't. So if she did have a child by Joseph Smith, that child died, and then later Olive died. Nancy Winchester. She was born in 1828 in Pennsylvania. She was 4 years old when her parents converted to Mormonism, and then the following year they moved to Kirtland. Little is known about her or her family, except that they did end up in Missouri and then Nauvoo, and they were in the 3rd Ward. We don't have the exact date of when she was sealed to Joseph the first time, but she would have been 14 or 15 years old. She was resealed to Joseph in 1846. She did it along with 6 of his other wives, and then she married Heber C. Kimball for a time. and he stood in as proxy for Joseph for her eternity sealing. That is why we say Helen Mar Kimball was the youngest at 14, but Nancy might have been 14 as well. So we're not sure which one of them is the youngest of Joseph Smith's brides. She immigrated to Utah in 1849 and settled there with her parents. By 1865, she had separated from Heber C. Kimball and she married Amos George Arnold. But it sounds as if she was given to him from Heber. And that man was promised that if he married her and had a child with her, that he would then be given a younger wife later. She had a son, but she had really bad health after that and died in 1876 at only 47 years old. And he did marry a much younger girl named Ruth Powell and went on to have 13 children. Agnes Coolbrith. Agnes was baptized in July of 1832 and then gathered in Kirtland. She boarded at Joseph Smith and Emma's house. On July 30th, 1835, she married Joseph Smith's brother, Don Carlos. You'll know that earlier I read a quote from Don Carlos that he was against polygamy. She was 8 years older than Don Carlos. 3 years later, when Joseph fled for Missouri, they followed him. Don Carlos left on a mission and she was left alone with their 2 children. Her home ended up being burned and looted by the mob, and she had to flee with her children, carrying her 2-year-old and a 6-month-old across an icy river and through snow. Sources say that Don Carlos was very much in love with her and would write her poetry. She ended up settling in Nauvoo with her now 3 children, waiting for Don Carlos to come back. As I said, Don Carlos was opposed to polygamy, and he said that any man who practiced it would go to hell, even if it was his brother Joseph. In 1841, he got malaria and died at only 25 years old. Their daughter, Ina, says that on his deathbed, Joseph Smith asked if he had any last requests, and he answered, so Don Carlos said this to Joseph, "Yes, I have. Joseph Smith, I want you for the rest of your life to be an honest man." 5 months later, Joseph Smith would marry her. He cited the Old Testament and how brothers were supposed to take on their brothers' wives after they died. But I can't imagine his brother would have been very happy about that, with how opposed he was to polygamy, to now know that his beloved wife had become one of many wives of his brother. After Joseph Smith's death, she married George Albert Smith, but she didn't choose to go to Utah. And so she later married a 4th husband, William Pickett, and they eventually moved to California, leaving Mormonism behind. She changed her name back to her maiden name so that she could separate herself completely from Joseph Smith and from Mormonism. And her daughter Ina also decided to go by a different last name. Ina became an American poet, writer, librarian, and prominent figure. And in San Francisco, she was called the Sweet Singer of California and was the first poet laureate of California and the first of any state of the United States to have one. Helen Mar Kimball. She was 23 years younger than Joseph Smith. She was only 14 years old when she married Joseph Smith. She was born in 1828 in New York. She was the 3rd of 9 children of Heber C. Kimball and his wife, Violet Marie Kimball. She would be the only daughter that would survive in their family, and so she was very beloved. In 1832, her parents were baptized into the Mormon Church when she was 3 years old. Later, Helen was baptized by Brigham Young in the Chagrin River during winter, and the river was frozen, so her father had to cut a hole in the ice for her to be baptized. She said she was not bothered by the cold water, as she had, quote, longed for this privilege and, quote, and felt no cold or inconvenience from it. The family soon settled in Kirtland, Ohio, and Heber was called to be an apostle, so he was gone a lot. She attended Eliza Snow's school in a house connected to Joseph Smith's home and used the Book of Mormon as a textbook and would go out into the woods to recite passages from the New Testament by memory. When she was 9, her family left for the West. She talked a lot about the fear that they had for the mobs while they were in Missouri and how scared the children were all the time about these mobs. But a half a year later, they were able to leave for Illinois in the dead of winter. This journey was a hard trial for the family as they went from shelter to shelter and house to house while they waited for Heber to return to the family. He found them in May and they settled into poor conditions in Commerce, where their house had a dirt floor and a leaky roof, and their family suffered much illness. She told a story of when Joseph Smith came to visit. Her father had sent her 2 china dolls from his mission. Joseph picked one up and broke the head off. And she said, "He merely remarked, 'As that has fallen, so shall the heathen gods fall.'" I stood there a silent observer, unable to understand or appreciate the prophetic words, but thought them a rather weak apology for breaking my doll's head off. She loved music and dancing and theater, and her childhood and teen years were filled with these kind of activities in Nauvoo. She joined the choir. But in 1843, Heber C. Kimball was invited into Joseph's inner circle. And according to his son, Orson, Joseph made an appointment with Heber and told him about plural marriage, and he asked him for his wife, Violet. Heber and Violet agonized over this for 3 days of praying and crying. He said, quote, "We touched neither food nor water for 3 days and 3 nights. And finally, quote, with a broken and bleeding heart, but with soul self-mastered for the sacrifice, he led his darling wife to the prophet's house and presented her to Joseph. Joseph wept at the proof of devotion and, embracing Heber, told him that it was all that the Lord required. Joseph told Heber that this had all been a test. He was testing him to see if he would give him his wife. Their reward for this righteousness and loyalty was that they were sealed for eternity. And he then asked Heber to take a plural wife. Heber didn't seem happy about it at first. He let Violet choose, and she chose the 2 elderly Pitkin sisters. But Joseph had other plans in mind. And so he had chosen Sarah Peake Noon, a convert from England with 2 small daughters. Heber reluctantly agreed. So then Joseph came to them again and asked for their daughter. Helen was now 14, and she wrote this: "My father was the first to introduce plural marriage to me, which had a similar effect to a sudden shock of a small earthquake. Without any preliminaries, my father asked me if I would believe him if he told me that it was right for married men to take other wives. The first impulse was anger. My sensibilities were painfully torched. I felt such a sense of personal injury and displeasure. For to mention such a thing to me, I thought altogether unwary of my father, and as quick as he spoke, I replied to him, short and emphatically, 'No, I wouldn't.' This was the first time I ever openly manifested anger towards him. Then he commenced talking seriously, and reasoned and explained the principle and why it was again to be established upon the earth. Then father asked me if I would be sealed to Joseph, and left me to reflect upon it for the next 24 hours. I was skeptical 1 minute, believed, then doubted. I thought of the love and tenderness that he felt for his only daughter, and I knew that he would not cast her off, and this was the only convincing proof that I had of its being right. I knew that he loved me too well to teach me anything that was not strictly pure, virtuous, and exalting in its tendencies, and no one else could have influenced me at that time, or brought me to accept of a doctrine so utterly repugnant and so contrasting to all of our former ideas and traditions. Having a great desire to be connected with the prophet Joseph, he offered me to him. This I afterward learned from the prophet's own mouth. My father had but 1 ewe lamb, but willingly laid her upon the altar." I'm going to stop in her testimony for a minute to fast forward a little bit. She will be a staunch defendant of polygamy in her old age. And so when you talk about her, LDS apologists will use against the horrific idea of him marrying a 14-year-old is, well, she must have been okay with it, and it was great, and he probably didn't, sleep with her, but she was a supporter of polygamy later, so it's okay. I think it's important to keep that in mind, that argument, as you're reading her thoughts as a young girl, because we know what she thought when she was 14, and she did not want to marry him, and this was repugnant to her, she said, but she trusted her father, who gave her to Joseph Smith. The next morning, Joseph visited the Kimball home, and she wrote, "He explained the principle of celestial marriage, after which he said to me, 'If you will take this step, it will ensure your eternal salvation and exaltation, and that of your father's household and all of your kindred.' The promise was so great that I willingly gave myself to purchase so glorious a reward." I stop and I think, this 14-year-old, I have a 14-year-old daughter, this 14-year-old was convinced that her entire family's salvation and her own were a reward for her marrying a man in his late 30s, instead of knowing that salvation comes through Christ alone and his love for us. None but God and his angels could see my mother's bleeding heart when Joseph asked her if she was willing. She had witnessed the suffering of others who were older and who better understood the step that they were taking, and to see her child, who had scarcely seen her 15th summer, following in the same thorny path, in her mind she saw the misery which was sure to come, but it was all hidden from me. So she married Joseph Smith in May of 1843. Many will argue that underage marriage was normal at this time period and to marry older men in the 1800s. But the 1840 census, I feel like it's very important to bring this up right now. I'll probably bring it up again later. The census in 1840 says that the average marriage age for women was 21 to 22 years old. But also, most of the time, they were marrying men who were a little older than them, but not 23 years older than them. Obviously, that was not unheard of. But there is a difference between a 14-year-old marrying a man 23 years older than her and a 22-year-old marrying a man 24 years older than her when she's an adult and consents to it. I still think it's gross that he married women in their 20s as well. But it is very important to know that do not listen to the argument that it is normal for a 14-year-old to be marrying a man that much older than her in the 1800s. It was not normal. And even the people back then that were getting married younger or marrying men that were older than they were going to be the only wife. So there's that as well. In the winter of 1843 to 44, there were weekly parties happening at the Joseph Smith mansion. Helen would write about all these social happenings that were going on and how her friends were attending the dances and she wasn't allowed to go. Her 16-year-old brother William was able to go, and she wrote this: "I had to stay at home as my father had been warned by the prophet to keep his daughter away from there because of the blacklegs and certain ones of questionable character who attended. His wife Emma had become the ruling spirit and money had become her god. I did not betray William, but I felt quite sore over it and thought it was a very unkind act in father to allow him to go and enjoy the dance unrestrained with others of my companions and fetter me down, for no girl loved dancing better than I did. And I really felt that it was too much to bear. It made the dull school still more dull, and like a wild bird, I longed for the freedom that was denied me, and thought myself as a much abused child, and that it was pardonable if I did murmur. I imagined that my happiness was all over, and brooded over the sad memories of sweet departed joys, and all manner of future woes, which by the by were of short duration, my bumps of hope being too large to admit of my remaining long under the clouds." She also wrote a poem that detailed her confusion about the marriage. Initially, when she was first saying, okay, fine, I will marry Joseph Smith, that she thought that it was for eternity, but that meant she could have her life to herself and she didn't have to act like a married woman at 14 years old. And when she found out that wasn't true, this is the poem she wrote: "I thought through this life my time will be my own, the step I now am taking for eternity alone. No one need be the wiser, through time I shall be free, and as the past hath been the future still will be. To my guileless heart all free from worldly care, and full of blissful hopes and youthful visions rare. The world seemed bright, the threatening clouds were kept from sight, and all looked fair. But pitying angels wept, they saw my youthful friends grow shy and cold, and poisonous darts from slanderous tongues were hurled. Untutored heart, in my generous sacrifice, thou didst not weigh the cost, nor know the bitter price. Thy happy dreams all o'er, thou'st doomed also to be, barred out from social scenes by this thy destiny, and o'er thy saddened memories of sweet departed joys, thy sickened heart will brood and imagine future woes. And like a fettered bird with wild and longing heart, thou'lt daily pray for freedom and murmur at thy lot. But couldst thou see the future and view that glorious crown awaiting you in heaven, you would not weep nor murmur. Pure and exalted was the Father's aim he saw, a glory in obeying this high celestial law. For to thousands who've died without the light, I will bring eternal joy and make thy crown more bright. I've been taught to revere the prophet of God and receive every word as the word of the Lord. But had this not come through my dear father's mouth, I should not have received it as God's sacred truth." In June of 1844, her father Heber was away for church business and wrote her this letter: "My dear daughter, be obedient to the counsel you have given to you. If you should be tempted or having feelings in your heart, tell them to no one but your father and mother. If you do, you will be betrayed and exposed. You are blessed, but you know it not. You have done that which will be for your everlasting good, for this world and that which is to come. I will admit there is not much pleasure in this world. Be true to the covenants that you have made. Be a good girl, your affectionate father." I find it so sad that it seems like these people just were giving up life. There's no joy to be had here, but we'll have it later. Her father would eventually marry 43 wives. She said, "I had in hours of temptation when seeing the trials of my mother felt to rebel. I hated polygamy in my heart." She would be sick a lot in her life, and it sounds like she always attributed that to a lack of faith in the principle of celestial marriage. And eventually she felt so guilty about not believing in this and murmuring about it that she fasted for an entire week, because she kept fasting until she finally gained a testimony of the principle of plural marriage. After Joseph's death, she became a widow at 16 years old. She married Horace Kimball Whitney, whom she had liked. He was also a musician and well suited to her, but it was for time only. And he stood in for her temple proxy sealing with Joseph Smith. They began to travel west, and they had a really hard journey. She would have 11 children with Horace, the first in May while he was away, and it was stillborn. Her next two would also die at birth. She became ill, very ill, their first winter in Utah and was close to death. And she attributed this to demonic attacks. Again, would often attribute her sickness to her sinfulness or her rebellious nature. She said this, "I had loved my baby more than God and mourned for it unreasonably." So she has a stillborn baby, and because she is so sad and heartbroken over it, she somehow has told herself that she's being punished with illness because of her pride, because she loved that baby more than God, without realizing she was just going through normal mourning, and it's completely reasonable to be that sad about a baby dying. But she couldn't see that. And so after fasting and weeks of guilt, she began to recover finally. Horace became one of the first staff on the Deseret News newspaper in Salt Lake City, and he worked in the tithing office for Brigham Young. He was told by Heber that he needed to start acquiring his plural wives as well. And he did so after Helen gave her consent. But she did agonize over it, and that made her feel even more guilty. And again, when she was physically ill, she felt like it was a punishment for not loving this in her heart. The first wife that he took died soon after giving birth, and then that child died soon after her. But in 1856, he married again and had 3 children with her. Like I said, Helen became a staunch defender of polygamy. I sometimes have wondered when I've learned about her story, because of what we know about how she felt, that every illness was punishment over her negative feelings. I do wonder if her staunch declaration of polygamy was a way to try to keep herself and her remaining children safe. Her husband Horace died and left quite a bit of debt. And then she had more illness and shock as one of her children ended up marrying a non-Mormon. She died in 1896 at the age of 68. Hers is a story that I find to be one of the most despicable and horrible stories. I think he stole her life. She may have gone on to be a defender of polygamy. She may have gone on to marry and have children, but she could have married him without having Joseph. Her husband married others too. I see this girl and I think, what life could she have had if her family had never been introduced to Mormonism and Joseph Smith? What would her life have been like? That breaks my heart. I feel like I need to show a picture here, because most of these women, we are seeing the picture of them in their old age. Most of them are not as beautiful as they probably were in their younger years, and they're old. And so if you're just seeing these pictures, it's very easy to fool your mind into thinking he was married to only older women and only unattractive women or whatever, and not look at polygamy the way it was. Somebody took a picture of Helen Mar Kimball and used technology to age it down. And so you can see from this picture of her, they take her face exactly here and age it down. And so this one is probably very close to what she would have looked like at 14 years old. And if we could see the pictures of these women, of what they looked like at the time that Joseph Smith married them, it would be a lot harder to justify it, because this probably is what she looked like when he married her. And she is a child. Next, I'm going to talk about Lucy Walker. This is another one of the heartbreaking stories to me. She was 16 when she married Joseph. She was born in 1826 in Vermont. Her father was baptized first, and then her mother followed a few years later. The family left Vermont in 1834 to gather with saints in New York. In 1838, they left with the other saints to Missouri. Along the way, they were surrounded by mobs who forced some of the women and children out of the wagons, including her mother. They pillaged the wagons, stole all the weapons, and then left these people with their wagons and hardly any of their supplies. So they had to try to continue to a camp with so many of their provisions gone in the snow. They made camp within 5 miles of Haun's Mill. Her father went to the mill to counsel with President Joseph Young and others that were there temporarily. And so he was there when the shooting took place, and he was wounded in the arm. After a lot of suffering and trials, the Walker family finally arrived in Nauvoo in spring of 1841. But her mother, along with so many others, got malaria and died in January of 1842, leaving 10 children behind. As her mother was dying, she called all of her children to her bedside, and she bore a faithful testimony to them about her convictions about Joseph Smith, that he was a prophet of God. She exhorted her children to never depart from the truth. And that is an important point. I need you to think about that, of this young girl whose mother that she loved on her deathbed tells her, Joseph Smith is a prophet. I know he is. Always listen to him. Her father, John, was heartbroken, and his health, quote, seemed to give way. Lucy remembered. The prophet came to the rescue. He said, if you remain here, Brother Walker, you will soon follow your wife. You must have a change of scene, a change of climate. You have just such a family as I could love. My house shall be their home. Place the little ones with kind friends and the 4 eldest shall come to my house and be received and treated as my own children." So then he was sent on a 2-year mission to the eastern state. Lucy said this, "I wrung my hands in the agony of despair at the thought of being broken up as a family and being separated from the little ones." So Lucy is now 15 years old, and she moves into the home of Joseph Smith. Her father told her that these 2 years would go by so fast, and Joseph Smith would call them his daughters. Even when they went around town, he referred to them as his daughters. She says this, "In the year 1842, President Joseph Smith sought an interview with me and said, 'I have a message for you. I have been commanded of God to take another wife, and you are the woman.' My astonishment knew no bounds. The announcement was indeed a thunderbolt to me. He asked me if I believed him to be a prophet of God. 'Most assuredly I do,' I replied. He fully explained to me the principle of plural or celestial marriage, said this principle was again to be restored for the benefit of the human family, that it would prove an everlasting blessing to my father's house." "What do you have to say?" Joseph Smith asked. "Nothing," Lucy replied. "How could I speak, or what would I say?" Joseph encouraged her to pray. She said, "I was tempted and tortured beyond endurance until life was not desirable. Oh, that the grave would kindly receive me, that I might find rest on the bosom of my dear mother. Why should I be chosen from among thy daughters, Father? I am only a child in years and experience, no mother to counsel, no father near me to tell me what to do in this trying hour. Oh, let this bitter cup pass," and thus I prayed in the agony of my soul. She said she felt a darkness and an agony, but she continued to pray. So after she has had this darkness and she doesn't feel right about it, he comes back to her and says, "It is a command of God to you. I will give you until tomorrow to decide this matter. If you reject this message, the gate will be closed forever against you." Lucy said, "This aroused every drop of Scotch in my veins. I felt at this moment that I was called to place myself upon the altar a living sacrifice, perhaps to brook the world in disguise and incur the displeasure and contempt of my youthful companions. All my dreams of happiness blown to the 4 winds. This was too much. The thought was unbearable." And she said, "Although you are a prophet of God, you could not induce me to take a step of so great importance unless I know that God approved my course. I would rather die. I have tried to pray, but have received no comfort and no light." And she said, "Every feeling of my soul revolted against it." And he walked across the room and said, "God Almighty bless you. You shall have a manifestation of the will of God concerning you, a testimony that you can never deny. I will tell you what it shall be. It shall be that joy and peace that you never knew. If you will pray sincerely for light and understanding in relation thereto, you shall receive a testimony of the correctness of this principle." And again tells her to pray sincerely so that she'll get the right answer. She said, "I thought I prayed sincerely, but was so unwilling to consider the matter favorably that I fear I did not ask in faith for light." So she, of course, felt the burden of her salvation and her family's, and she now had a deadline of 24 hours. So she spent the entire night pleading to God. And she said, "Oh, how earnestly I prayed for these words to be fulfilled. It was near dawn after another important word, sleepless night, when my room was lighted up by a heavenly influence. To me it was in comparison like the brilliant sun bursting through the darkest cloud. The words of the prophet were indeed fulfilled. My soul was filled with a calm, sweet peace that I never knew." So as morning came, she had received this powerful and irresistible testimony of the truth of the marriage connection called celestial or plural marriage. And I'm going to talk later about a spiritual witness, but this is a very good example of how when you are told, if you pray sincerely, you will get this outcome. That then a lot of times people who are sincere, they will continue to pray until they get that outcome, because if they don't get it right, and I'm speaking from experience here, that you then feel like there's something wrong with you, not that there's something wrong with whatever you're praying about. So she said, "I afterwards married Joseph as a plural wife and lived and cohabitated with him as such." Emma Smith was in St. Louis. This is the part I said to remember from when I talked about Emma being in St. Louis buying supplies for the hotel. That is where she was when he married Lucy. And she said, "Emma Smith was not present, and she did not consent to the marriage. She did not know anything about it at all. It was not a love matter, so to speak, in our affairs, at least on my part it was not, but simply the giving up of myself as a sacrifice to establish that grand and glorious principle that God had revealed to the world." After Joseph was killed, she was then married to Heber C. Kimball. And she said, "The contract when I married Mr. Kimball was that I should be his wife for time and time only, and in the resurrection he would surrender me with my children to Joseph Smith." She lived with her brother William, and they traveled to winter quarters in 1846, and then in 1848 arrived in the Salt Lake Valley. And she said, "Since 1845 I have been the wife of President Heber C. Kimball, by whom I have had 8 children. 4 sons and 4 daughters. I have lived in the same house with other members of his family, have loved them as dearly as my own sisters, until it became necessary, as children grew up around us, to have separate homes. And she did remain devout and died in 1910 in Salt Lake City. And this is another one of those stories that people will point to and say, it doesn't matter how terrible it sounds. She stayed devout her whole life. But again, let's try to think about what her life could have been. He stole her life from her, and then Heber C. Kimball did as well. But he did what he was so good at doing, which was separating young girls from their families and offering them salvation for everyone. She felt like her entire family's salvation was on her, the same way Helen did. Imagine what it would be like to be in his home. She, unlike Helen, she was dependent on him. She lived with him. He took care of her as his daughter. And then he comes to her, and having a father that's gone on a mission, having a mother that died telling her to always do what the prophet tells you to do. It's no wonder that she believed that she had a spiritual experience that told her this was right. Now I'm going to talk about the Partridge sisters. I'm starting with Emily. Emily was an obsessive journal writer, and so much of her history can be found in her own words. She was born in 1824 in Ohio. Her father was a hatter and had considerable property and had provided a very comfortable and nice house for their family. You can find her journals and read them fully to find out more about their family, but she was a playful girl and described the hatter shop and their home in detail. She seemed delightful. She described herself as most mischievous, and in part, this is what she said. I think my father must have been almost a rich man when I look back and consider the amount of property he owned. But when Mormonism came, our home went. Whether it was sold or not, I do not know, and I have never had such a home since. It was sometime in the year 1830 that 4 elders came to Ohio. Their names were Parley P. Pratt, Oliver Cowdery, Peter Whitmer, and Ziba Peterson. My mother soon believed the gospel after she heard it and was baptized by Parley P. Pratt. My father was not so ready to believe at first and told them he thought that they were impostors, when Brother Oliver Cowdery said he was thankful that there was a God in heaven who knew all of the hearts of men. What they said must have made considerable impression on his mind, for he sent to them after they were gone to Kirtland to purchase a Book of Mormon. And then he concluded to take a trip to New York and see the prophet for himself. And this is what Brother Joseph says of him in his history. It was December 1830 that Elder Sidney Rigdon came to inquire of the Lord, and with him came that man of whom I will hereafter speak more fully, named Edward Partridge. He was a pattern of piety and one of the Lord's great men, known by his steadfastness and patient endurance to the end. Then she goes on to say, Brother Joseph baptized him in the Seneca River on 11 December 1830. She goes on to tell how he went to visit their relatives, excited to share about the church, was very disappointed to find that they didn't want anything to do with it. His sister kicked him out of the house and told him she never wanted to see him again. One brother did accompany him back and did end up joining the church. Saints used their home as a stopping place on their way to Kirtland. She talked about these bright boxes that would be at their house, and she wished she could go through them. And then all the children in her family ended up getting measles because they were exposed to so much with so many people coming to stay with them. She did recover, but she was deaf in one ear after that. Her father bought a lot in Kirtland, but they never got to live there. On February 4th, 1831, her dad was called by revelation in D&C 41, verse 9, to be a bishop in Zion. So her father set out for a mission with Joseph and others, and he ended up staying there in Independence. Her mother said that this is when her troubles began, as he left her with the kids still sick with measles and lung fever. But she was staunch and true and saw the Lord in her trials as well as her blessings. Her father was also anxious about her young mother and her having to prepare to bring the children to Missouri on her own. I have a strong desire to return this fall, but I must not. You know I stand in an important station, and as I am occasionally chastened, I sometimes feel as though I must fall, not to give up the cause, but fear my station is above what I can perform to the acceptance of my Heavenly Father. I hope you and I may so conduct ourselves as at last to land our souls in a haven of eternal rest. Pray for me that I may not fall. Farewell, too, for the present. Her father put the business in the hands of a young man, Harvey Redfield, and the property was sold at a great sacrifice, as much as was sold at all. So much so that his friends said that he was insane for letting his property go for such a small amount. The next season, they started out west under the direction of W. Phelps, A.J. Gilbert. She wrote, Mother must have had a great deal to try her on that journey that we as children knew nothing about. What little money she had with her for expense, she was advised to put into the hands of W. Phelps, and he cheated her out of it. They went down the Ohio River to Cincinnati in a keelboat, and then they got on a steamboat. Their provisions were, some point on this steamboat, their provisions were rifled through and thrown overboard, and so they saw it floating down the river. They were forced to stop when ice became so thick. She describes them staying with a family that had a little cottage, a teeny little place next to the river, and they stayed with them for a couple of weeks. Then they were finally able to get a large wagon, and them and one other family were able to start again for independence. They were so happy to finally be reunited with her father, and she said this: "Whatever suffering and privation my mother had to endure, she never murmured or complained, but rejoiced that she was counted worthy to endure tribulation for the gospel's sake." Her father rented a log room from Boggs, Lilburn Boggs, the man we've talked about before, which is kind of weird. The next winter, houses to rent were very scarce, and so they had a widow and 4 children staying with them. So there were 12 to 13 people living in this place together. They stayed there until her father was able to build a small log house on the corner of the temple lot. She described the life here with Native Americans and the mobs and all of the persecution, and it sounds like there was crazy things happening. The children were scared a lot. And she said the children had heard so much about the mob that the very word was a perfect terror to them. They would often cry out in their sleep and scream, "The mob is coming, the mob is coming." Her father was tarred and feathered there in Missouri, and their store was broken up and their goods scattered in the streets when the printing office was demolished. The family soon settled in Nauvoo. There they got malaria, and Emily was sick on and off for a year. Harriet, her sister, was ill, so ill that she passed away, and shortly after, their father, Edward, died on May 27th after being sick for a week and a half. So Emily and her sisters began looking for work to support the family, and I bet you can see where this is going. She wrote, "The first door that opened for us was to go to President Smith's, which we accepted. I was a nurse girl, for they had a very young baby. That is what I delighted in, tending babies. Joseph and Emma were very kind to us. They were almost like a father and mother, and I loved Emma and the children." Emily and Eliza were happy to work in the Smiths Mansion house, but not for wages, but necessities of life. In 1842, they were accepted into the Relief Society, and after a year in the Smith home, she writes this, and she would now be 18 years old. "In the spring of 1842, Joseph said to me one day, 'Emily, if you will not betray me, I will tell you something for your benefit.' Of course I would keep his secret. He asked me if I would burn it if he wrote me a letter. I began to think that that was not the proper thing for me to do, and I was about as miserable as I ever would wish to be. I went to my room and knelt down and asked my Father in heaven to direct me, at Joseph Smith's insistence. I could not speak to anyone on earth. I received no comfort until I went back to say that I could not take a private letter from him. He asked me if I wished the matter ended. I said I did. He said no more to me for many months. Then Elizabeth Durfee, Mrs. Durfee, the mother in Israel, invited Emily and Eliza to her home. She described the doctrine of plural marriage to them, asking them if they had heard anything about that. She realized that she was being tested to see if she would talk about whatever it was that Joseph Smith said to her. And so she didn't say anything. As they walked home, Emily told her sister about Joseph's offer. Eliza felt very bad indeed for a short time, but it served to prepare her to receive the principle that would be revealed soon after. Joseph approached Emily again on February 28, 1843, her 19th birthday. She said, "He taught me this principle of plural marriage, but we called it celestial marriage, and he told me that this principle had been revealed to him, but it was not generally known." Mrs. Durfee comes to visit her again a week later and said that Joseph would like to talk with her. She was supposed to meet him that evening at Heber C. Kimball's home. So she wrote, "When I got there, nobody was at home but the Kimball children, William and Helen. I did not wait long before Brother Kimball and Joseph came in. Joseph and Heber Kimball sent the kids to a neighbor's home, and then they pretended to send her away as well. So she started for home. She said, I started for home as fast as I could so as to get beyond being called back, for I still dreaded this interview. Soon I heard Brother Kimball call, 'Emily, Emily,' rather low, but loud enough for me to hear. I thought at first I would not go back and took no notice of his calling. But he kept calling and was about to overtake me, so I stopped and went back with him. Back at the Kimball home, Joseph Smith spoke to Emily. She said, I cannot tell all Joseph said, but he said that the Lord had commanded him to enter into plural marriage and had given me to him. Although I had got badly frightened, he knew I would yet have him. Well, I was married there and then. Joseph went home his way, and I on my way alone. A strange way of getting married, wasn't it?" Later on in the Temple Lot case affidavit, she said that she roomed with Joseph the night following her marriage to him and said that she had carnal intercourse with him. She recorded that she slept with Joseph on many occasions. And so she spent her second night of marriage with him, and Emma was there in the same house, but didn't know. 4 days after his marriage to Emily, Joseph married her sister Eliza. Emily later claimed that neither of us knew about the other at the time. Everything was so secret. So I'm going to stop right there for a second and go to Eliza. So Eliza was born in 1820, and she was the oldest sister. She has obviously the same story of family as Emily did. In her words, when her dad went to Missouri, she said this, I was at that time very sick, and he had no expectation of seeing me again, but the Lord had called, and he must obey. When she was 17, she left home and taught school for 3 months, not hearing a word from home and not knowing anyone at the place that she was at. But then she returned to Caldwell and arrived in Nauvoo a few years later. This is when the family became so sick. And she said, "As we were by this time much reduced in circumstances, having moved so many times, and my father having poor health, it was thought best for me to take a school at Lima, a small town about 24 miles away, which I did, and my father rented rooms for his family in a large storehouse where several of other families resided. One brother Hiram Smith and his brother-in-law R.B. Thompson and two more families, as they had not had time to build yet. While I was teaching at Lima, I boarded with a gentle family and was well treated, but suffered fearfully with headache. About 2 weeks before my school was out, my father sent a man for me, saying my sister Harriet was dying. We rode all night and arrived home about sunrise. My sister was still alive, but died during the day. My parents took this trouble to heart very much, and my father said she was his pet child. His health was very poor, and he did not feel able to walk so far to his work. He was sick about 10 days when he also left us, most uncomfortably situated. I was too sick to attend the funeral. He was completely worn out with the hardships and fatigues of movings and exposure caused by our enemies, who never slackened their hands, but persecuted us continually. We were in very poor circumstances at the time of his death, the handsome property that he had when he joined the church having been spent in the church, and he not having the privilege of staying in one place long enough to amass more. So she worked sewing in tailor shops after that, and for a while, and she gives a detail that Emily didn't. After a year or two, my mother married again, so she could not, because she thought that she could not get along without someone to provide for her. She now had 3 daughters besides me and one son about 8 or 9 years old. Her husband's name was William Huntington, a very good man and kind to my mother and her children. After a time, my sister Emily and myself went to live in the family of the prophet Joseph Smith. We lived there about 3 years. While there, he taught us the plan of celestial marriage and asked us to enter into that order with him. This was truly a great trial for me, but I had the most implicit confidence in him as a prophet of the Lord, and I could not but believe in his words, and as a matter of course accept of the privilege of being sealed to him as a wife for time and all eternity. We were sealed in 1843 by Heber C. Kimball in the presence of witnesses. Now I'm going to go back to Emily's account. So during this time was when Joseph was starting to introduce some men to the endowment ceremony in the temple, and teaching them that it was necessary for exaltation. Women would also be getting it, and he wanted his wife Emma to be the first woman to get it. He said he wanted her to be the elect lady that got it first, and that then she could be the one to pass on the endowment to the other women. But it required a woman to be obedient to her husband, and since Emma was resisting plural marriage at this time, he would not allow her to get the endowment. Because of this, Emma agreed to let Joseph marry additional wives if she could pick them. If you are reading in the Saints book, you do not get that detail. You don't know that he was withholding the endowment from Emma, and that she believed that not only was she not going to get this endowment that was necessary for salvation, but also she wouldn't be able to pass it on to the other women. That is why she decided to give in. And this was a story that when I first told my husband, he didn't believe this part that came next until I pulled out that Saints book and I showed him. And they do have the truth of what happens next. They just left out that detail. She selected Emily and Eliza, her live-in helpers, not knowing that he was already married to both of them. Emily wrote this: "I do not know why she gave us to him unless she thought we were where she could watch us better. To save the family trouble, Brother Joseph thought it best to have another ceremony performed. Accordingly, we were sealed to Joseph Smith a second time in Emma's presence. Within a week, Emma received her endowment." Emily says this about Emma: "She had always up to this time been very kind to me and my sister Eliza, who was also married to the prophet. But ever after she was our enemy. She used every means in her power to injure us in the eyes of her husband and before strangers, and in consequence of her abuse, we were obliged to leave the city to gratify her. But this was overruled, and we remained in Nauvoo. My sister Eliza found a home with the family of Brother Joseph Coolidge, and I went to live with Sister Sylvia Lyons. She was a good woman and one of the Lord's chosen few. Emma, about this time, gave her husband 2 other wives, Maria and Sarah Lawrence. Shortly after this, Joseph was killed." And she wrote, "After the prophet's death, I again entered into plural marriage. I was married to President Brigham Young according to the law of proxy and received my blessings in the temple in Nauvoo. I had one son born in Nauvoo. He was named Edward Partridge Young Smith. She left Illinois when the baby was 3 months old, and she was now 22 years old. She was Brigham Young's 8th wife. He would marry over 40 more. She said that life with Brigham Young was very difficult, and she felt lost in a crowd of wives. She agonized over asking him to pay her bills. They had 6 more children together, but he was nearly absent in her life. She did have one of her children die. When they got to Utah, she was pregnant again and moved to the White House east of Eagle Gate on South Temple in Salt Lake City, and then into the Lion House. And if you go to Salt Lake City, the Lion House is still there. It's very well preserved. You can go take tours, and they have a restaurant there now, and everybody loves it and loves the food. They have rolls that are famous, it hits a little differently when you think about these wives that lived there. Her other children were born here, but another died. In 1869, she was sent to live in Brigham's Forest farmhouse, where the cows supplied milk and butter for the Lyon house. This was seen as a demotion, be kicked out of the Lyon house and sent to the farm. And she wrote about how much she hated it there. She also began to have really bad health from the work that she had to do on this farm. So in 1872, she did return to the city and began to write essays. She would not be supported by Brigham Young, and her health had been ruined from working in the dairy. When she asked for more money, she was told to go to, quote, the president's men, and she had to schedule appointments to see Brigham Young. She wrote this: "Today I am 50 years old. Can it be possible to look back upon my past life? It seems like a troubled dream. There has been but few, if any, pleasant reminiscences for memory to dwell upon. My children, they are my comfort." She records being very sick and neglected by Brigham and had long periods of illness and depression. She died at age 76 on December 9th while living with her daughter, Emily. And then back to her sister, Eliza. So after Joseph Smith's death, Eliza married one of the 12 apostles, Amasa Lyman, on September 28, 1846, as his fourth wife. Eliza's sister Caroline, who was 17 years old at this time, had also become one of his plural wives a few weeks earlier. He married 8 women in total, and his 8th wife was Lydia, another sister. So he was married to 3 of the Partridge sisters. She said, "A woman living in polygamy does not let it be known, and nothing but a firm desire to keep the commandment of the Lord could have induced a girl to marry in that way. I thought my trials were very severe in the line, and I am often led to wonder how it was that a person of my temperament could get along with it and not rebel. But I know it was the Lord who kept me from opposing his plans, although in my heart I felt that I could never submit to them. But I did, and I am thankful to my Heavenly Father for the care he had over me in those troubled times." They remained in Nauvoo for a few months, living part of the time back in her mother's house. And then in February 1846, they left Nauvoo and started toward Utah. Her family stayed in a place called Pisgah, but Eliza kept going. About 130 miles from there, the U.S. asked for the 500 men for the war, for the Mormon battalion. And she spoke of the men that went and how some died while gone and how their wives were sunk under the weight of care. But the prophet of the Lord had said go, and so they went, trusting in him. She gave birth on the trail, assisted by her midwife, Patty Sessions, who we've already talked about. That was another one of Joseph Smith's wives. "My first child was born here in a wagon. I have named him Don Carlos. I am very uncomfortably situated for a sick woman. The scorching sun shining upon the wagon through the day and the cool air at night is almost too much of a change to be healthy." Eliza was afflicted with what was called childbed fever, and she almost died. She said that she looked so much like a skeleton that when people saw her, they didn't know it was her until she told them who she was. By October, they had made it to winter quarters, and there Amasa built her a small log cabin. She said, "This was the first house my baby ever lived in. I feel extremely thankful for the privilege of sitting by a fire where the wind cannot blow in every direction." But by November, her baby had died. She said, "The baby is dead, and I mourn his loss. We have done the best we know how for him, but nothing has done any good. He continued to fail from the time he was taken sick. He was my greatest comfort and was nearly always in my arms, but he is gone and I cannot recall him, so I must prepare to meet him in another, and I hope a happier world than this. I still have friends who are dear to me, and if I had not, I should wish to bid this world farewell, for it is full of disappointments and sorrow." So she came west and was soon pregnant again. This child was also born on the trail, and she named him Platt Lyman. She reached the Salt Lake Valley on October 17th. Their first year in Utah wasn't without trials either. Amasa left on a mission, and the wives had to fend for themselves. They suffered from cold and exposure, and at one point she had to return to living in a wagon because her tent had burned down. Amasa sent supplies from California, where he was serving, and he would return and travel back frequently when he could. But 4 of his wives eventually went to live in California, and 4 were in Utah, and 3 would go on to leave him. In 1860, he was appointed to presidency of the church's European mission. He gave a sermon in Scotland, which basically denied the reality and necessity of the Savior's atonement. And so he was eventually brought before the quorum of the 12, and where he confessed his error and apologized. He wrote a letter of apology to the general membership of the church that was published in the Deseret News. He had been studying the teachings of a man named Andrew Jackson Davies, America's most prominent spiritualist, and even had participated in a seance in California. And so she said this about him: "I did not know what was wrong with him, but I could see that he was very unhappy." He later gave another speech very similar to that one in Beaver, Utah, and so at that point he was stripped of his apostleship, and he was excommunicated in 1870. He became more devoted to his wives, but he started associating with William Godbey, a leader of the Utah Liberal Universalism, and became president of the Godbeite Association. And this was the final straw for Eliza and the other Partridge sisters, and so they all left him. He died in Fillmore and was posthumously reinstated as a church member and apostle. She moved to Salt Lake City with her children and was called to preside over the primary. She passed away from pneumonia at 65 years old. The last 4 stories I've shared, Helen Mar Kimball, Lucy Walker, and the 2 Partridge sisters, those stories really hit me and really struck something in my heart that made me very sad. I do feel like those 4 women were robbed of their life by Joseph Smith. Honestly, I think all of them were. I'm going to return to Fawn Brody's book for a moment and give a little bit more insight into Emma. Only Joseph's intimates knew that Emma nagged at him incessantly to be done with plural marriage. Occasionally, she expressed her bitterness to Joseph's second counselor, William Law, whom she knew to be unalterably opposed to polygamy. Hiram Smith, who had several wives himself and did not have his brother's difficulties with the first, urged Joseph repeatedly to write down the revelation on celestial marriage. I will take it and read it to Emma. He said one day in renewing the argument, and I believe I can convince her of its truth, and you will hereafter have peace. Joseph replied with a wry smile, you do not know Emma as well as I do. Before the afternoon was spent, however, he sat down and dictated to his secretary, William Clayton, the last and most epoch-making revelation of his life. All that he had been thinking and dreaming over the past years, everything that had conceived about heaven and hell and sex, which he had never before dared commit to paper, he now dictated in a great rush. After a long justification of polygamy on biblical grounds, he went to the heart of the matter in a special commandment to Emma, to receive all those that have been given unto my servant Joseph, and to cleave unto my servant Joseph, and to none else. The penalty for her disobedience was savage. If she will not abide this commandment, she shall be destroyed, saith the Lord. For I am Lord thy God, and will destroy her, if she abide not my law. But if she will abide this commandment, then shall my servant Joseph do all things for her, even as he has said. And I will bless him and multiply him and give him 100-fold in this world of fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters, houses and lands, wives and children, and crowns of eternal lives in the eternal world. Then followed a concise statement. If any man espouse a virgin, and if he and desire to espouse another, and the first give her consent, and if he espouse the second, and they are virgins, and have vowed to no other man, then he is justified, he cannot commit adultery. And if he have 10 virgins given unto him by this law, he cannot commit adultery, for they belong to him. This is Doctrine and Covenants, section 132. This is still in the Doctrine and Covenants that the Mormon Church uses today. Hiram took this revelation to Emma and returned sometime later, angry and crestfallen. In all of his life, he said he had never been so abused by a woman. When Joseph had heard him through, he remarked quietly, I told you didn't know Emma as well as I did. Can you imagine? You're given a revelation from your husband, the prophet, that says that you have to be okay with this, and if you're not, God will destroy you. Emma was terribly shaken by the sight of the manuscript. Sorrowfully, she said to William Law, the revelation says I must submit or be destroyed. Well, I guess I'll have to submit. There was a hard core of resistance in Emma that Joseph simply could not wear down. She pleaded with him and badgered him, threatening and weeping, until finally he brought the revelation home and gave it to her. She dropped it in the fireplace, put a candle to it, and watched with grim satisfaction the long foolscap pages turn to curling, fragile bits of ash. But Joseph had a copy made. On August 12, 1843, Joseph asked Hiram to read the text of it to the members of the High Council. Austin Cowles, whose daughter was one of Joseph's wives, and Leonard Sobey were the only men among the 12 present who opposed it. But they fought with such vigor that they put the whole council in confusion. Gradually, the church hierarchy became divided into a polygamist and anti-polygamist faction, with William Law championing the minority. Emma worked quietly against polygamy among the women. Your husbands are going to take more wives, she warned, and unless you consent to it, you must put your foot down and keep it there. Joseph added to the bewilderment and disbelief within Nauvoo by excommunicating anyone caught preaching or practicing polygamy without his sanction. Everything else shows his moral fiber as not being very good, but this shows his hypocrisy. He's excommunicating anyone who talks about it and says, there is never but one on earth at a time on whom the power and its keys are conferred, he wrote. And I have constantly said, no man shall have but one wife at a time unless the Lord directs otherwise. He could always add those little caveats, unless the Lord directs, and he only is going to direct him. And he's going to direct him not only for his wives, but also for the wives that others can have. That's it. That is all of the wives that I have enough information on to share. I know this has been a lot over the past few videos. Hopefully it has been interesting to learn about these women. I just felt like it was so important. And as I was planning for these videos, I was making the list of the women before I went and researched them. And I said their names out loud, every single one of them. And I found that I had this feeling of connection to them. And I just felt like it was so important to not just say, oh, he had this many wives, and let's talk about a couple of them, but let's say their names out loud. Let's hear something about them, no matter what it is. And so I appreciate you being here to watch this. And I think that polygamy is one of the most well-known things in the church in its members, although my husband did not know that Joseph Smith was a polygamist, even though he was brought up in this church and his family is so devout. He had no idea that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. And so I think this information is so important to get out there. And that is why I wanted to really go into depth, not only to make sure people know that Joseph Smith was a polygamist, but that they also know how he did it, and that they know something about these women, that they're not just faceless, nameless women. In the next video, I am going to read the church's essays that they have put on their website for anyone to go read that explain polygamy. And I will have some final thoughts after that before we move on to the end of Von Brody's book.